Every time there's a new Porsche 911 GT3, the reviews invariably end with, I don't know how they're going to improve it. I've been guilty of this myself. Funnily enough, each successive GT3 does tend to be better than the ones that preceded it. For this new 992 generation, the evolutionary steps do seem to be particularly small. So, is the new 911 GT3 better than ever? Stay tuned to find out. So at this point, I'd usually show you around the car and tell you about the specs and the pricing, but we're at Phillip Island, and that's a GT3. So I'm going to go and drive it. This thing is so fast. It really should be a condition in the contractor sale of every GT3 that you've got to use it on track at least once. It's what these things were designed for. Anyway, the reason that there's questions about this new GT3 is that it looks pretty much the same as its predecessor. And by looks I don't mean the actual physical looks, I mean the bits underneath. Engine's the same, gearbox is the same, tyres are the same, weight's the same, even the performance is the same. 0 to 100 k's an hour in 3.4 seconds and a 318 km/h top speed, exactly the same figures as the last car. Now that doesn't make the 992 GT3 a bad car, as the last car was simply awesome, but for almost $500,000, you might expect a little more progress. How then, given the two cars are so similar on paper, is this thing 17.5 seconds faster around the Nürburgring in Germany than its predecessor? Well, that's because there are two big improvements that you can't see. The first is double wishbone front suspension. Now, this is the first 911 road car ever to have a double wishbone front end instead of a strut. It's an extremely expensive process to implement, but it's been deemed worth it because under heavy loads, like you might find on, say, a racetrack, it's much more stable, doesn't flex as much, and more stability means more confidence and more grip and faster lap times. The second big change is downforce. This thing produces way more downforce than the last car. Pressing the car into the ground harder and harder the faster you go. And those two changes make the GT3, well, probably pretty awesome at every track, but especially at a fast-flowing racetrack like this one, it's absolutely mega. So one big change for the GT3 is that it's now got two modes. It's got sport mode and track mode, which stiffens the suspension basically, and that's about it. Got to be a little bit careful as the rain comes down. So the engine might not have changed much. It's only got another 10 horsepower, 7 kilowatts and 10 newton meters, but, well, didn't really need to change, did it? 4 litre flat 6 revs to 9,000 RPM. Sounds absolutely insane. Incredible throttle response, heaps of torque, revs like crazy. There you go, this end of the track's dry so we can dig in a bit. Oh, so much grip, my arms are going to come off. Gearbox, fantastic. So fast, so immediate. 255 down the main straight, hard on the brakes. Brakes, fantastic feel. They just don't give up. I suppose they'd give up eventually, but you certainly aren't going to wear them out unless you're a really hard charger. The biggest change though is this front end. There's so much feel, but it's so direct now. If you really want to get the best out of this new GT3, you still do have to drive it like a 911, get the weight on the front tyres, don't accelerate too soon because you'll understeer, but you can just drive it conventionally and still go so fast. It's got so much front end grip now, it almost feels sort of more mid-engine than rear-engine. And when you do turn the wheel, this thing has so much grip. You just keep turning and turning and turning and it digs in. That's where that downforce comes into play at these faster turns. Like, it's actually making my arms hurt. These fast corners, it is just vacuum to the ground, and there's so much feel through the steering. You can place it exactly on the limit of grip. You just keep diving in harder and harder and harder. How does this thing have so much grip? Heaps of traction. ESP basically never comes in. This sharpness and the response of the front end and that downforce, which just glues the car to the ground in fast corners. Oh, I can't believe the corner speeds you can carry in this thing. I can't drive this thing hard enough. It's more car than I've got talent. What an absolute machine. All right, I could drive this thing around here all day, but let's head back into the pits and have a look at what makes this thing so special. So how does the 992 GT3 produce this incredible level of performance? Well, starting at the back here, that downforce comes via the massive diffuser and this new swan neck rear wing, which attaches at the top rather than the bottom. Hidden away down there, 4-litre flat six, which revs to 9,000 RPM, produces 375 kilowatts and 470 Newton meters through a 7-speed dual clutch gearbox. These rear wheels, massive. 21 inches around, 12 inches wide, wrapped in 3 15mm wide Michelin Cup 2 tyres. These rear brakes are bigger than the front on most performance cars, 380mm discs with 4-piston calipers. The fronts are even bigger, 408mm disc, which is basically the size of an entire wheel on a standard hatchback. And if you give Porsche 20 grand, it'll make them bigger again and made from carbon ceramic material. The 911 GT3 might be very driver focused, but it's not a stripped out race car. The interior is basically the same as a regular 911, albeit with a bit more Alcantara, and it's very nice. You still get keyless entry and a decent stereo and climate control. You can even option heated seats. Unlike a regular 911, you do lose the rear seat, but that just gives you another place to put stuff. But if you tick the Club Sport pack, it gets filled full of roll cage. The driving position is super low, as you'd expect, and I love that Porsche has kept the central analog tachometer and flanked it with a pair of digital screens. Porsche's Infotainment is a slick unit that's easy to use and has smartphone mirroring, app services, digital radio, Apple Music and more. Active safety equipment is conspicuous in its absence. There's none of the driver aids you'd find in most regular cars, so you'd best pay attention when you're behind the wheel. But as good as the 911 GT3 is on the track, you're going to use it a lot more on the road, so can it still deliver the goods? I was a bit nervous about driving this new GT3 on the road, as to cope with the extra downforce, Porsche's had to stiffen the suspension substantially. For all its racetrack prowess, this is a road car first and foremost, so it's no good if it rattles your teeth out every time you drive it. As it turns out, I needn't have worried. Despite the stiff suspension and ultra-low profile tyres, there's still compliance here. Comfort is the wrong word. This is a very firm car and you feel every bump, but it's also like every bump's just had the edges rounded off so it doesn't jolt or jar. A bigger issue is probably the fact that the front end tends to follow every camber and ridge in the road. This isn't a car in which you can just relax and drive with one finger. It's always moving and reacting. It's also extremely loud in terms of road roar. 911s tend to be, but this is next level, to the point that on a coarse surface at 100 k's an hour, you can barely hear the stereo. At lower speeds, there's also a resonance from the exhaust below 2000 RPM, which buzzes through the car and seat. Initially it was pretty irritating, but I must admit it's faded with familiarity. If you're buying a GT3, it's unlikely to be your only car, but could you daily drive this thing? Absolutely. It's funny, the clunks and thumps and shudders that would seem unsavoury in a normal car are all part of the experience in something like this. If you do want to add a GT3 to your garage, I'm afraid there are two bits of bad news. The first is that the standard price swells substantially when you start ticking options, this car wearing almost $60,000 worth of extras. The second, much bigger problem is that the GT3 production run is vastly oversubscribed. Getting a car isn't necessarily impossible, but will be very difficult. So, is the new 911 GT3 better than ever? Yes, of course it is, and it's a much bigger evolutionary step than it appears on paper. But, if I had a 991.2 GT3, I don't know if I'd be rushing out to upgrade. Yes, it's objectively better, especially on track, but it's also a different 911 experience thanks to that stability and super sharp front end. The exception to this is that if you're such a good driver that you've already reached the limits of your old GT3, then this will definitely force you to up your game. The only remaining question now is, in the face of ever-tightening regulations, how are they going to improve it?